In an Arizona courtroom, about a dozen people pleaded not guilty Tuesday to charges of conspiring to overturn the 2020 presidential election. An indictment unveiled last month ties 18 people to an alleged fake electors scheme to keep Donald Trump in office, quote, against the will of Arizona voters. President Biden beat Trump in the state by more than 10,000 votes. Trump's former attorney, Rudy Giuliani, was among the defendants arraigned Tuesday. Others include his former campaign lawyer, Jenna Ellis, and the Arizona GOP's former chairwoman, Kelly Ward. Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is also charged in this case. He will be arraigned next month. CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett joins me now to explain the players on the racing form here. Major, remind us of why Arizona was so central to the story of the 2020 election and the attempts to overturn President Biden's victory.
John, great to be with you. So Arizona and Georgia represented the two states most surprising to former President Trump's reelection campaign in 2020. Trump had won Arizona by 3.5 percentage points, but the final vote totals in 2020 showed him losing it by about 0.3%. That shift not only cost him 11 electoral votes, but suggested that also Georgia was something he was going to lose too. And those two states were among the very first in which aggressive efforts were undertaken to overturn the certification in both those states. Arizona is particular in that those efforts were not just procedural and legal. There were lawsuits filed, more than 7 in Arizona, but there are also almost instantaneous efforts to intimidate vote counters in Maricopa County, the state's most populous county, and harass members of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and the Arizona legislature. And those efforts, though they were not successful, did augur or foreshadow a much more aggressive form of election denialism, where violence or threats of violence is part of the conversation that we're still living with now.
Absolutely. It leads me right into my next question, which is there are now 4 states that have similar fake elector cases: Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, and Georgia. At least in the cases of Georgia and Arizona, they involve a lot of the same people. Why is that important? In other words, these aren't just individual events in individual states, though each state is different. Explain the kind of connectivity between these 4 different fake electors operations.
It matters that the same people are involved because they're very high-level people, very close to former President Trump. And what that tells us, John, at least according to the allegations, is that this was not a spontaneous grassroots effort among Americans frustrated by an election result and not fully versed in election law in their state, who were raising what in their minds were legitimate questions about an outcome that was very close. That's not what this is about. The allegations are that this was a concerted effort by people who knew better or had every reason to know better that their legal challenges either were not going to be validated or were based on very thin evidence or no evidence at all in the case of Arizona, who nevertheless conducted persistent efforts to organize people, file false paperwork, to sow confusion, and then try some never-before-argued constitutional theory that because there's confusion, an election result can be overturned. What all 4 of these states, and maybe others are trying to protect is the valid rules in their state so they're followed in the future.
So that point is crucial, the sort of, oh, it's confusing, so we can run any play we want. That's in front of us again. We're less than 8 months away from the election, 8 months away from the election certification process, the same process that brought about this case in Arizona. What's in place now to stop some shenanigans like this from happening?
Well, there's also, not also, but there is in place now much greater awareness of this threat. Secretaries of State, county boards of supervisors, everyone who's involved in the election administration space knows that now not only are they scrutinized, but they are hyper-scrutinized. And if they're anticipating in their battleground state a close election, many of them are, you have to have everything aligned and aligned properly. They also know that in this atmosphere of intimidation and threat, you have to have conversations with your sheriff's office or your police department to protect you. And all those preparations are being made. Most importantly, though, the laws still apply. And what states are trying to do is protect their law, because the Constitution, John, as we know, doesn't establish a federal Bureau of Elections. States conduct their elections according to their laws and their procedures. And if you believe in federalism, If you believe that that constitutional construct is good for our country, then you want states to protect their rules and their procedures. And that's what these legal cases are all about.